to paddle us up in a minute, but I will say this. Oysters. There's a lot going on in the state of Texas. It's a really complicated policy issue. It can be emotional, but fundamentally, people are making their living out on the bay harvesting oysters, and they've really struggled to do so recently. We've had a lot of different issues that have impacted the health of oysters, certainly in Galveston Bay, dating back to Hurricane Ike in 2008. And it puts pressure on other places on the coast. And we sort of culminated with a real scarcity of oysters in our waters this year. And so I thought it'd be interesting to pull some folks from different aspects of the oyster industry, so to speak. And in no particular order, I'm going to ask them to come up. John Blaha is with the Coastal Conservation Association. Come on up, John. You get a seat at the Price is Right here. So CCA is a long-time conservation organization that actually started in Texas as the Gulf Coast Conservation Association, and now is a national organization, has operations across the country, and they've done a lot related to oysters and oyster restoration. Blake Branson is here. So Blake is a new oysterman, and he's a new sort of Texas oysterman. And what I mean by that is that the state legislature in Texas was sort of slow to the party of allowing oyster mariculture. There's oyster mariculture across the country. Places, even Alabama has oyster mariculture, Florida has oyster mariculture, North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Massachusetts, all the East Coast oysters that you eat are mariculture oysters. And Texas did not have that. And so Texas allowed that, I believe, 2 legislative sessions ago, and it's still in its infancy. And I think Hannah Kaplan is here as well. Hannah is also an oyster woman running a mariculture operation. So we're going to hear about that and how that plays a part in Oysters in Texas. Emma Clarkson from the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. So CTWD is the entity that sort of regulates our fisheries, and oysters are one of our fisheries. And they are in a difficult situation, right? You've got the conservation folks on one side and the oyster folks on one side, and both think TPWD is not doing enough, right? So the conservation folks think the TPWD is too easy on the oystermen, and the oystermen think they're too hard on the oystermen, and so it's really a tough place. And so thank you, Emma. And Emma actually drove all the way up here from Corpus Christi to be here, so thank you for making that ride. Next on the list is our own Haille Leija. Haille does a lot of things for the Galveston Bay Foundation, but she sort of oversees our oyster restoration work, and has been working in that field for many years now. We're fortunate to have her, and she's going to talk about some of the restoration activities that we do and others do to try to essentially supplement. We can restore oysters in Galveston Bay given enough funding to do so. The oyster can restore oysters in Galveston Bay given enough funding to do so. So it's a matter of making that happen, and then in some ways hoping for some good weather as well. And then last but not least on this panel is Tracy Woody. Tracy's been a longtime friend of GBF, lives on Smith Point, and he operates Jeri Seafood. And so Jeri Seafood is a wholesaler. Yeah, round of applause. So several generations of oystermen in Tracy's family. Tracy's father-in-law was Ben Nelson, I believe, right, Tracy? Did I get that right? Yeah, so the Nelson family on the east side of the bay. There's several families around Galveston Bay. They don't necessarily get along necessarily, but we won't get into that tonight. But they all care about the health of Galveston Bay. Truly, the people who live on Galveston Bay and make their living on the bay absolutely care about the bay. And I know that in some cases, oystermen get sort of a bad rep for pulling every oyster out of them. Well, they don't necessarily think of it that way, and I don't think of it that way. They're trying to make a living. They do want to make a living in a sustainable fashion. So I'm sure we'll hear from Tracy about that. So thank you all for joining us tonight. So I'm going to get started just with some questions. Maybe we're going to talk a little bit about just background on oysters in Galveston Bay, and this sort of applies across the state of Texas as well, but let's concentrate on the bay. So Tracy, I think you maybe have the longest history here, but just talk to me about the rich history of oystering in Galveston Bay, that goes back for generations, and and tell me, you know, your sort of story and your family story there.
Okay, is this thing on?
Yes.
All right. Well, you know, in Texas, and mainly around Galveston, back in, I guess, the 1800s, the boats would go out and catch oysters, bring them to the dock, and sell them to the local restaurateurs that came to the dock and bought straight off the boat. If your product didn't get bought, it was sent back out to be put back out on the reef or go, hopefully on the reef. And I think that's where some of the oyster reefs, oyster leases started. People would apply for permits. When they hauled those oysters back out, they'd plant them on their own private lease. So they could go back and harvest them and come back and sell them. But then came the railroads, and this one entrepreneur decided he would pack up oysters, you know, in barrels, and he'd put seaweed in there with it, or seagrass, and he also said if you sprinkle a cornmeal in there while they were on the train going to Chicago, they get fatter on the way. So, you know, when refrigeration came around, well, then we were shipping, you know, all over the country, and all over the rest of the country ships to us too. So, you know, it's a give and take. Because we, you know, all of us will have bad years, good years, you know, hurricanes, droughts, and I think the other question was about the family. My father-in-law, his grandfather came here and was in, at that time, all types of seafood, whatever. I mean, they even hunted ducks and sold them and trapped and, you know, whatever you could do to make a living back then. But as time went on, we got more and more into just oysters and strictly oysters. And you know, after my father-in-law passed away, which I've been working in the business since 1980, so I'm not new to this, but I've got a little bit under my belt, and I'm seeing a lot, and I'm still learning every day because every year teaches me a new lesson.
Tracy, talk about just the bounty of oysters in Galveston Bay. I mean, Galveston Bay used to produce over 75% of the oysters that came from the state of Texas, right? I mean, there were a lot of oysters, you know, until maybe Hurricane Ike, or maybe, you know, before that. But, you know, give us some perspective on the productivity of Galveston Bay.
Yeah, I can remember, I think what the deal was you had fishermen that would fish oysters a short period of time. They didn't fish them all winter for 6 months. You would have shrimpers that would chunk their shrimp gear off, put an oyster dredge on. They'd do that for, you know, a month or two, and they hated it because it was gritty, grimy, you know, heavy. And somebody would catch a shrimp and try that with their oyster gear, and the shrimp gear went back home, and they went back to shrimping. So it was really during the holidays, you know, November, December, where a lot of oysters were harvested. And so there was a lot of areas in Galveston Bay that never got touched. In fact, if the boats, I can remember if the boats went out to those areas and brought those oysters in, they were real snappery. We'd get on to them and say, hey, don't go back there. I know where you went. You know, don't bring those in, because they wouldn't yield as good. And at that time, really, everything was about shucking. There was no such thing as a half-shell oyster. It all went in a sack, and everybody wanted the biggest oyster you could get. The half-shell market came along, I guess, in the early 80s, and that kind of changed things. And then the shrimp, limited entry on the shrimp license, buyback program, so a lot of people got out of shrimping. And the boat was still there, so they bought a working license, and we ended up with, we went from somewhere around 320 licenses sold a year to, I think, around 900.
Just in Galveston Bay?
Yeah. Well, no, in Texas.
Stay away. Mm-hmm.
So, really, I would say the fishery is overcapitalized. I think anybody in our industry, if they would answer honestly, would say the same thing.
Too many oysters.
Yeah, we should have had a buyback program the minute that the limited entry went in. In fact, it wasn't a limited entry; it was a moratorium, and everybody ran out. You know, spent the last 8 months buying a license, and that's how we got to that point.
Thanks. So just maybe this is Emma, maybe this is you, Tracy, but back until the 70s, people were taking oyster shell out of Galveston Bay simply to use as road base, right? I mean, it wasn't that one. Talk to me about that.
Yeah, so,
Yeah, sorry, probably me too. Bring the mic closer to you.
so mining shell out of the bay was outlawed, I think, in '65 in Galveston Bay. It continued on the southern coast, I think, had been through the '70s. But I looked at the historical records on the permits where the barge loads were recorded, because it was permitted through Parks and Wildlife, so they had to record each barge load and the yardage. And I don't know that every barge load was counted for. I think back then they would get the observers on the boat, feed them steaks, get them drunk, and, barge loads would not be counted. But I did the math on it, and there was enough shell harvested or mined out of Galveston Bay, just for roads, cement, whatever, that you could put a 3-inch thick layer of shell over the whole city limits of Houston.
Wow. And so clearly just another unsustainable practice that led to less reef in Galveston Bay.
I have an article in an old magazine, when magazines were about this big. It was the gas company here in Houston said that, they could never run out of shell. There was enough shell because they were fracking it or breaking it, I guess using the gas to break it down to make concrete or something.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, there's a lot of places that thought they would never run out of shell. New York Harbor, Chesapeake Bay. There's a whole list of them. Let's see, Emma, I didn't put this on my list of questions, but I think you'll know this. Set up the stage for like oystering in Texas. When does it take place? What's the season? And then talk a little bit about leases versus public reefs, and just for not everybody knows the whole background on even when oyster season is.
Oh, certainly. So.
And then you probably need to pull that mic closer too.
I'm not loud enough now. Can you guys hear me? Okay, so Texas is really unique in that we have a very large wild oyster fishery, and I sometimes call it the last frontier of the Gulf of Mexico because it is so large. I think it's 30 million last year. So that being said, we have a wild fishery from November through April. And then there's also this, we call them certificates of location. That's the technical term, although you may know them as leases. And so that gives the authority to an individual to kind of garden their own oysters, put down mulch, work it, and then they have exclusive rights to that. And so that's what you refer to as leases. And those can be worked year round.
And that's just in Galveston Bay. There's no other place in the state that has that?
So there were historically leases in other bay systems, and Tracy actually probably knows more about the history in Texas than I do, but there were some in Matagorda Bay, I believe, and they were not successful. And so over time, the ones in Galveston Bay are all that remain.
Yeah, and so my understanding, and you all can correct me, is it's about somewhere between 20 and 25% of the reefs in Galveston Bay have private leases on them.
I think it's 26%.
26%.
Something right around there.
Yeah. All right, so rough estimate. So again, that means that for about 75% of the reefs are the public reefs, and the season starts November 1st and it goes to April 30th.
I think you're talking about production.
Maybe production.
Production, not yet.
Okay. And Johnny is also in the oyster business. Thank you. We've got a couple folks in the audience. And so, again, just for perspective, from November 1st to April 30th, the public reefs are open, and then they're closed the rest of the year. But then the private leases oysters can be harvested year-round because they're essentially private farming operations.
As long as they adhere to the Texas Department of State, as long as they adhere to the Texas Department of State Health Services rules. And so there's a time temperature matrix. It's basically, once it hits a certain air temperature, they have to get into refrigeration by a certain time. So that kind of makes the middle of summer a bit of a challenge when you have like an hour to get them to refrigeration.
Yeah.
But yeah, as long as they're compliant with human health concerns.
So basically, people say, oh, don't eat oysters in months without an R, right? But that's not really the case as long as you have good refrigeration. That stopped being the case when refrigeration came about. But there's still clearly, and oysters are very heavily regulated on the health side as well. Right? We won't even get into that tonight. Texas Department of State Health Services regulates that. The last thing they want is somebody getting sick from eating a Texas oyster. So we won't get into that. All right, so we do have, if either of the three of you have any perspective on the history, you're welcome to chime in. Otherwise, I'll get into what I sort of call modern day problems in Galveston Bay. And I think this started with Hurricane Ike. Does anyone want to talk about that? John, maybe? Give a little bit of background, or Tracy, or Haille, or Emma, whoever.
I'll give my perspective. I'm sure Tracy can speak to it.
Maybe a little closer to the mic. Yep.
Tracy can speak to it much more in detail. Obviously, it's like after Ike, with the push of sediment and all that, we lost roughly 50% of the oysters in the bay system, and I think in East Bay, seems like I've been told it's even more than that. The challenges, with those challenges came along other challenges. Then we saw the push of the industry spread out down the coast, no fault of their own. That's just the way it happened. Over time, the fleet becomes more mobile. Every one of us in here, I would assume, to eat an oyster, the demand gets stronger, and as that resource is degraded in one area, it's going to be taken from somewhere else. Then we dealt with Harvey and other hurricanes between Ike and Harvey. In addition to things like what was twice a year floods at times, and then the droughts all mixed in between. So Hurricane Ike definitely kind of took a little bit of a smoldering fire and turned it into a bigger fire. And perhaps as a state, perhaps we're behind the curve a bit maybe in how we deal with those type of issues. And I think it's something that's going to take all sides to sit together and get this figured out. It's a common cause, because in the end, if we don't have these reefs, the guys, the industry's not going to make the money, and the ecosystem's going to not be as pristine as it once was, and we've got to look forward into doing that. And I think Ike was the big kicker that kind of kicked this ball rolling down the hill.
Yeah, thanks, Tracy.
Yeah, Ike.
Mike, please.
Yes, Ike silted quite a few reefs, but what really happened with Ike was we didn't have much rain with it. It was a pretty dry hurricane, and we were already in a drought, and the drought continued after that. And what happens in the drought, oysters love high salinity, and so do all the predators. And we had a lot of boring sponge and snails. The boring sponge will eat a shell up in a short period of time. I honestly think within a year, under real high salinity or less, it will eat a whole shell up. It'll feel like a piece of balsa wood. You can just about crumble it in your hand. And so when the wave action is moving it around, it comes around and turns into shellhacks. Shellhacks will not support the attachment of spat, because a spat will suffocate in a paper thin layer of silt. And so as that shellhash moves, it sinks, and then the larva dies.
Yeah, just, again, not everybody has the same level of expertise with spat. Just to tell everyone what spat is.
Yeah, so spat is when the male and female oysters release the gonad material that's floating in the water. It gets together, develops an embryo that floats, somewhat swims in the water, mostly carries around, I think, 18 to 21 days. I'm sure somebody here can tell you better. And then that looks for a good hard surface above the mud to attach and grow, and they'll attach to anything. If they'll grow in a creosote pile, they'll never grow in anything. So, you just got to have something above the mud. And I'll say this, I'm not sure about all the other bays, but I will say Galveston Bay is substrate deprived. There's not enough reef. We're not larva deprived, because one adult oyster can produce up to 500, a female can produce up to 500 million eggs in one season. So it doesn't take a lot of gonad material to develop oysters. You just got to have something to set and survive. Oh, one other thing, so after Ike, we were still in the drought, and then the BP oil spill came on. It wasn't a direct impact of the oil, it was Louisiana shut down, which is a major producer, and put all the demand on Texas. And so everybody was just, it was wide open. In fact, we had to pass a law after that because some harvesters were shoveling a third of that 100-pound sack with nothing to shell. And so every third 18 we would leave in Texas was part of the reef.
Yeah, go ahead.
A little bit more about Ike. So one of the things that was kind of unique about Ike was that storm surge sedimentation. So you guys probably are all still recovering from Harvey when we had that, massive amount of fresh water just come into the bay and sit there, and you had that mortality. But there was a huge amount of sedimentation, as John indicated. 50% of the area that we surveyed showed some mortality, mostly down in East Galveston Bay. And there were some sub-bottom profile surveys done, and you could see this large sediment overburden, up to a foot to 2 feet on the edges of reefs. And when we do restoration, we use maps from the 90s and then the maps we created in the late 2000s after Hurricane Ike, and you can actually see the areas where, Oyster was mapped in 1991 as present and then gone. And so you see that edge of the reef retreating. And so that really started oyster restoration in bulk for Texas Parks and Wildlife. And so, it was a whammy of a decade. We had Katrina and Rita and Ike, and then the BP oil spill, and Louisiana coming over. And so we started seeing these opportunities for restoration. And a big part of some of the largest funding that we've had came after those hurricanes, where we've demonstrated this loss, that kind of receding edge of the reef, and received funding to go back and try to get that back because it was lost from that sedimentation. And that's when we started seeing a lot of restoration beginning to occur with the state. We did restoration before that, but they were usually much smaller projects. Then when those hurricanes came through, that kind of jump-started it.
Yeah, and then just to complete the sort of meteorological difficulties that oysters had, Haille, can you just talk about all the rain we had, in basically the drought ended, and then we had nothing but rain, and what is, how much, like 400 or 500 year storms in 5 years, and what does that do to oysters?
Yeah, great question. So Hurricane Harvey essentially turned Galveston Bay into a freshwater lake, and while oysters are very resilient, when the water gets too fresh, they will close up, which means they're not feeding, they're not getting oxygen, and they're not going to reproduce. So not only did that result in oyster mortality, but it also prevented them from spawning. So we saw fewer adult oysters as well as fewer babies, particularly in the upper reaches of Galveston Bay, since we have the Trinity, San Jacinto coming in with all that fresh water. So, you go back to, let me think, was it 2015, one of the tax day, then Memorial Day floods, and then Harvey. So it was just 3 years right in a row of incredible amounts of fresh water. And it takes some time for that to come out of the system, but I think, like somebody said earlier, we are fortunate that we have an abundance of wild larvae, which is pretty unusual just in the entire United States. We're one of the last great resources there. So they will bounce back, it just does take time. And I did want to add one more thing about Hurricane Ike. You hear about the sedimentation and that substrate getting covered up. Like Tracy said, those oysters need something hard to attach to. So that's when Galveston Bay Foundation really got into the mix with oyster reef restoration, and we started recycling oyster shells from restaurants, trying to get that substrate back into the bay, and working with all the partners you see up here to make that happen.
Great, and we will definitely talk more about that too. I'm excited about that. And then Tracy, you referenced it, but what goes on across the Gulf can impact Texas. It wasn't just Deepwater Horizon. More recently, Louisiana struggled with too much fresh water, and so how does that put pressure on Texas? Maybe John or anybody else, feel free to chime in.
Well, I think.
And then pull Mike, sorry.
I think Louisiana still having issues with fresh water. They're diverting. They're cutting some. The conversion areas out of the Mississippi River to
Bring sediment.
to let the sediment rebuild the marshes. Well, now that's changed where all the oysters are being grown, and so now where the area, the habitat's good for oysters, there's not enough substrate, so there's a lot of oysters that are dying right now. So it's going to put more stress Texas or every other state, Virginia, Maryland, I mean, this is the first year I've ever bought oysters out of Canada, so.
All right, so let's fast forward to the 2021-2022 season. Clearly we had all kinds of problems with scarcity. Like, whoever feels comfortable talking about that, just maybe set the stage for, primarily Galveston Bay, but up and down the Texas coast, about what we saw this year that we really just don't see very often.
Yeah, I think going into this, it's important to understand that there are a lot of things, as you've heard about, that impact the number of live harvestable oysters in a bay. And it's not just how much they've been harvested, it's what the salinity is, it's their sedimentation. And so, as Haille alluded to, it was 4 years of flooding in a row, and so we had a lot of decreased salinity, increased fresh water. So already oysters are stressed, and already there's a lot of mortality up and down the coast. And then you have some, sentinel issues in that there's a couple of areas that had been closed the previous year because of low oyster abundance that remained closed the following. And so you have these freshwater impacts, and then you just have these beginnings of signs of habitat loss and degradation that kind of spill over from year to year. And so I didn't really quite talk about it during the history, but just in case you guys don't know, Parks and Wildlife has a number of tools in our management toolbox, and one of them that we started using in 2013 and 2014 was the ability to close areas during the season, because if the live oyster abundance doesn't reach a certain threshold, we'll close an area. And so a lot of areas were not reaching that live oyster abundance threshold because these mortality incidents or because habitat loss. And so more and more areas kept closing, pushing the fleet in different places. And a lot of the time, the fleet is very mobile, the oyster fleet is. And so if things aren't working in Galveston, they can go down the coast. But as you move down the coast, the salinity problems got exponentially worse. Like Coconut Bay, which is now becoming one of the more productive bays in Texas, was in single digits for months.
Single digits on parts per
Sorry,
thousand on
single
salinity.
digits of salinity, yeah, and so there was quite a bit of mortality there. So all of a sudden, there's not a whole lot of places that you can go fish because of a lack of live oyster abundance, because of closures, because of the salinity mortality. So it kind of distributed the fleet in a way that I think was undesirable for a lot of people. And it was definitely a huge management challenge, and I'm sure that's getting into what we're going to talk about later, is this management challenge is when you start seeing fewer and fewer opportunities to harvest.
Tracy, what did you see this season, maybe compared to other seasons?
Well, definitely, just a lack of abundance of oysters, lack of production. More areas closed this year than I think ever has been closed at one time. And
these are temporary closures as opposed to permanent closures.
Correct.
A different issue on the mid-coast later in the season.
yeah, I don't think there was hardly any health department closures. It was mostly TPWD closures. But yeah, it was just really, it was hard to get oysters. And in fact, on November 1st, I was calling some of my guys that I buy from in Louisiana and told them, I need, that's the first day of the season. I said, I need you to go ahead and ship me a load. And they thought I was kidding, but I wasn't. I was serious. And of course, they had worked all their reefs really hard, and most of those guys didn't want to touch them until May 1st or let them grow up. And then they waited and waited. And so yeah, it was difficult. So we purchased a lot of Virginia, Maryland, Connecticut, everywhere.
So, again, I feel like a lot of this is going to Emma and Tracy. John, feel free to chime in. You might have some on this.
Just from I live in Rockport, I live in Randus County, out in Lamar on Goose Island. So, I think it was 16 when the first time the fleet kind of moved down the Haille all floods and slid down, 15, 16 maybe. And then, as a community, and again, it's no fault of theirs, just how the system's set up. And then Coconut was closed for a year or two, and it opened back up. And you talked specifically about the challenges of this year. I know San Antonio Bay, Espiritu Santo, up around Sea Drift in that area, was fished pretty hard in the prior season, I guess the 2021 season. And when it seemed like, and Tracy, Johnny, whoever may be able to tell me differently, so like once the season opened, they weren't around Sea Drift very long. They moved south pretty quickly, and then it was early on we started seeing the closures of Galveston, and before we knew it, pretty much all the fleet was in that lower San Antonio Bay, Aransas, Coconut Bay systems. Again, it's the ecological primary, a lot of the ecological factors, as Tracy mentioned earlier, perhaps some overcapitalization at some times, and the system that needs to be continually tweaked. I think there's been a lot of changes in the management of the system in the last, say, 10 years or so, and those changes are going to continue. They're going to have to continue in order for it to remain sustainable. Here we are. We've been fighting floods, and it's like we were talking a while ago with Tracy. Now we could really use some rain. Things are crunchy, and so what does the 22-23 season going to yield? That's we'll see. Once the season opens, see how the summers go. If we get any storms, what's going to be affected. I'm personally, as someone that lives in that Aransas County area, I'm personally really concerned about a storm and facing issues like Galveston Bay did after Ike. It really does. And we took the hit from Harvey. We took increased pressure, so we're losing some of that structure that perhaps protected itself to a point before, and that kind of starts leading into leases and everything else in my mind. Okay, what are we going to do to protect this?
Well, great segue. I was just going there. So I mean, let's get to the glass half full. Maybe hopefully the glass is still half full here, because there's got to be some hope here, right? So how do we move forward and address these issues? It's sort of an acute problem, but it's been simmering for a long time. And I like the analogy Don used. It had been burning, and it all of a sudden really burned strong. So where do we go from here? Emma, I know TPWD. Sorry to put you on the point here. TPWD is trying to figure this out with the rest of us, right? So what are they thinking about work groups and restoration, and how do we move forward in a positive fashion, hopefully bringing together the constituents, the oystermen, the fishermen, anybody who loves oysters.
I'm gonna take a step back, does
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
to give some background information. So resource managers have a set amount of tools in our toolbox for how we can approach things like this, right? We have the ability to regulate harvest in terms of harvest seasons and the amount harvested in terms of sack limits or the time of day that you can harvest. So we have the ability to change harvest restrictions. We have the ability to do temporary closures like we were talking about. I'll call those in-season closures. There are also abilities to do, or authorities to do, permanent closures as were proposed last year. And in 2017, we closed several areas permanently, like Christmas Bay is one of them that were ecologically significant, as just they're very important habitats, and they couldn't maintain oyster harvest and maintain the ecological value. So just so you guys know that these are the tools in our toolbox. We can do closures, we can do restoration, we can support increased mariculture, but it's a pretty limited toolbox. And so what isn't limited are the ways that we get to the numbers, and how, at what threshold do we close, and which of those tools do we use when. And there's a lot of science that comes in. There's shell budget models, as you were talking about, substrate limited. And so if you harvest a lot of shells, if you harvest a lot of oysters, you take the shell out with them. And so there's ways to kind of estimate how much shell comes out of the water, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a ton of math that you can throw at this. MSY, maximum sustainable yield, and stock assessments, and all of these numerical things that you can do. But in the end, it takes all of that, and it does take input from industry. I was reading, for fun, the old fisheries management plan and the Parks and Wildlife Code, because I like to read code when I'm bored. That's a good
Hopefully
sign.
it'll put you to sleep at night.
No, it wakes me up. And so I was reading it, and it is really interesting that, back in the 80s, when that fisheries management plan was written, it talks about how sustainable fishery includes estimates, of economic importance in the industry as well as ecological importance. And it actually states ecological importance must be taken into account beyond economy, but economy must be taken into account too. And so it is, you have to have input from all sectors that use this resource because it is people's livelihoods. And so to that end, if you guys listened to the commission meeting, we were given that directive to form some task force to work together with members of the industry and members of conservation organizations. That is coming soon. Those decisions are made at a much higher level than mine as to who's going to be on those task forces and when they're going to meet. But yeah, so moving forward in a way that we can all work together towards a sustainable harvest, and that what is sustainable and how you get there, that's the question that we all have to work together, because there's different ways to run that math. There's different ways to calculate that. Like you said, there's a lot of oyster reefs and there's a lot of oyster boats and there's a limited amount of oyster reef, and that's what it comes down to. We had that license moratorium, as Tracy mentioned, right as the moratorium hit, a bunch of people went out and bought licenses. So there's this huge spike in number of licenses. And now a higher percentage of those are active. So you actually somehow saw an increase in this effort down the Texas coast in the last 10 years. So we really didn't have to work together to manage that, to manage pressure, and management, sustainable management of a resource includes considerations of salinity, not just fishing pressure, but natural mortality as well. You have to think about all of that. And so kind of investigating the best science and getting that input from our constituents is really the path forward. In hand with restoration, that's another tool that we have. And so restoration alone is not going to save Texas oysters, and oyster mariculture alone is not going to save Texas oysters. It has to be kind of a strategic plan with all of that in place.
Okay, let's let Blake talk. So, Blake, thank you for joining us. I give you a quick introduction, and again, Hannah's here too. And so the difference between Blake and Hannah is I didn't know Hannah before tonight. I got a chance to meet Blake, which is why he's sitting up here. She's sitting back there. Next time, Hannah, we'll have you up here as well. And you're free to chime in. But so talk to me about the future of mariculture in Texas. Like, how is this happening, and where is it happening, and when will it be happening?
Sure. So cultivated oyster mariculture is kind of the what's that other lever we can pull, basically, right? So you think about there's maybe 20,000 acres of wild oyster reef in Texas, 2,000 acres of leased bottom land. So cultivated oyster mariculture is what's referred to as off-bottom farming. We should really call it off-bottom ranching because it's Texas and these are animals. But I'll an aside. So the way that cultivated oyster mariculture works essentially is you start with, they call it quarter-inch seed that's grown in the hatchery. You throw them in a bag in these floating cages that sit at the top of the water surface, and then over, let's say, 8 to 12 months, they grow into market-sized oysters. You pull the bag out, you take it to market. And the difference is, this is not reliant upon existing oyster reef. It's not reliant upon habitat. Things like silting, not a problem because you're on the top of the water surface. There's a lot of, this has been around for 30 years, but it's a technological advancement in some sense, right? So you've got these manufactured cages. It's fairly high density within them. A single acre produces 150,000 oysters a year. But it's also labor intensive. You really have to be out there on a very frequent basis to tend to your equipment. And so it's high intensity, but it's a very productive way to make a very high quality product. And so there's, it's kind of a, perfect sort of culmination of potentially economically useful, ecologically valuable, and not really competing against the traditional sort of resource constraints for it.
Yeah. And maybe, I don't know if anybody can answer this question, but why was Texas so late to the game in mariculture? Is it just tradition? We were gosh, we can't have it because we didn't have it?
It's for Texas. No.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know why, but I do know that we actually worked on a proposal for oyster mariculture before it was actually adopted, and it didn't go through, 5-6 years ago, or maybe a little bit longer than that. And then this time it did. I think it was just a matter of having the right buy-in and support when we did, and Representative Todd Hunter and pushing the bill. And I think that kind of gave it that jump where it didn't have that much support first. And also one of the differences was, I think the first time we were proposing on bottom mariculture, and this time it is off bottom. So this is strictly only floating cages, things that are not sitting on the bottom.
Yeah,
So I'll,
question? Yeah, Ellen.
Who owns these floating?
So Ellen's question is, who owns the floating cages? And Blake, you can
Sure,
answer that, and
so-
tell
so
how you
it's-
get into that business as well.
what you essentially do is you apply for a permit through the state, through multiple government agencies, right? So you first go to Texas Parks and Wildlife and say, I want to establish an oyster farm here. You go through the permitting process with them, then you have to go to U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the General Land Office to actually get your lease, and then you go back to Texas once more at the end, they give you the final stamp of approval, and then you go out and you put your equipment in place, and then you're essentially responsible for it. So you sign up for 10-year leases. We'll see in 10 years if they renew them. That's, we're still in the very front end of this experiment. But it's essentially each acre is leased out to individuals, and then they're responsible for maintaining and running that equipment. There are other states that have a little bit different model where they basically say, okay, this is designated as well, I think they call it an oyster park, basically, where anybody can go kind of sublease a section. But here in Texas, you go and you say, okay, this is my plot where I want to do this, and you kind of walk through the permitting process with various Texas government agencies.
Yeah, so I mean, it requires private investment, like you're investing in this. This is a small business. You're creating a small business.
It is, absolutely.
In
So-
fact, quit your job to do this, right?
Quick, yeah, exactly. So is that the highest use of capital and time? There's probably some question about that.
It is in this room tonight, I can guarantee you.
There
It's a
are-
great use of
So
capital.
we call that in the private equity world goodwill. There's definitely some of that here.
George, let him finish it, I'll get you next.
Actually, I was gonna comment on, Emma's point here. On the Texas was late to the party, but the glasses half full side of that is, by not being first movers, they've done a lot of things, I think, to be much more, learn some lessons from the other states for how they've gone about the permitting process. And so Texas, it's very clear from TPWD that this is a priority to them, right? There's members of, the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department who their sole purpose is essentially to try to encourage fools like me to go do this type of thing. And, it's like you think about, you've never walked into the DMV and had oh, let me help you get this driver's license. So this is, from a state government agency, just to have that level of resource put in towards encouraging this, it's very clearly a priority, and let's take advantage of the government actually trying to make things faster, not slower for us.
Great, George, did you have a question, sir?
Okay, so after I Florida, which is one of the major oyster producing areas of the Gulf Coast, which has been devastated, they don't even have wild oysters anymore, and they've gone to this process. And, they're doing this, and my question is, how competitive price-wise is it to the wild oyster market that we have? I mean, what do you produce an oyster? What is your commercial?
Tracy probably has a much better answer than that, but generally speaking,
And then the question was about how the pricing compares to
Yeah,
wild
how does it
oysters,
compare?
just for those who didn't hear.
from an economic standpoint, these are considered premium oysters. You're selling, so the best sort of parallel for me is, it's like craft breweries versus Budweiser, right? So very much the
I don't think
marketing.
Tracy's gonna agree with that.
Well, like from a marketing standpoint, there's these small farms, they try to have a bit of sort of, pizzazz about their particular location, their particular flavor, a lot of trademark and branded names, right? And so that's very much the craft brewery model versus sort of the commodity market model for it.
And what's wrong with Budweiser?
Nothing's wrong with
So
that.
answer the question, what's the cost?
So, Tracy, wholesale price of a wild bottom oyster versus a cultivated oyster?
Well, so cultivated oysters are all over the board. Some people, I guess, feel they're a lot more valuable, and, I don't know if they just don't sell that many or what, but, this year, both of those prices, I guess the wild oyster actually has came up so much this year that they're pretty close right now, but we're out of season.
Right.
And of course, Texas was everything was closed pretty well around the January, 15 through 16. So, I would say during the winter months when the sea's open and boats are harvesting every day or 5 days a week, there's gonna be a substantial difference in price, probably, and I'm assuming y'all want to time your production for the summer months, probably when you can get more money from them, I would assume. So, you know, probably anywhere from 40 cents an oyster for a wild reef oyster and maybe around $1, I guess is whichever.
Well, how about this? I mean, Haille is actually, so, Blake is kind of on the front end and is not quite producing oysters yet. Haille, you are producing oysters, so you can speak to this. So,
Yes, so currently we're selling our oysters for 60 cents. We are using a distributor, so once we cut out the distributor, we can sell them for more money. And once we really get our processes down correctly, we can increase our price as well with the distributor. So that's kind of where we're at now. I think that will go up once, you know, the market in Texas understands what the oysters are like. Sorry?
Is that the artificial or whatever, the farm raised or?
Yes,
Okay.
correct.
yeah, so
Yeah.
Haille, this is your first year of production, right? I mean, you were the first one essentially in the business in Galveston Bay, and you've had some success. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, we planted our 6 seed in October, and we actually were expecting it to take closer to a year to come to harvest. We started harvesting about a month ago. We could probably harvest by 10,000 a week if we had the manpower, but weather and manpower has been an issue for us in
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So your oysters that you produce, you know, I've seen a lot of European, you know, operations. And so the oysters they produce are very perfect. I mean, they're not all this garlic thing, they're just perfect shells. Is that what your oysters look like?
I would say about 90% of them, yeah.
Okay.
They kind of, sometimes they grow into each other, they grow into the bag and kind of misshape them, and we don't really sell those.
Right.
But
They look
the
a lot
ones we sell at
better.
restaurants are
Yeah, okay.
Well, and let me say, I mean, I think mariculture, Oysters in Texas, I think are going to be complementary. I mean, they're not, you know, hopefully, Nicole, yes.
I just want to say that if everyone is coming to the Oyster Fest, Hannah's Oysters, you can taste and see them in person in that section of the Oyster Fest.
Yeah, that's June 4th. Where exactly, Nicole?
She'll be there.
Yeah, that's super, that's super. And again, I think people may or may not know this, but when you go to like State of Grace, and you order an oyster from Massachusetts, or you order an oyster from Maryland, Virginia, those are all mariculture oysters. There are not native spat sets on the East Coast. And they're smaller because they let them sell them smaller, right? Our mariculture size is still 3 inches, or is it 2 inches?
2.5.
2.5, so it's slightly smaller. Okay.
The other
So
point to
market size of a natural oyster or native oyster is 3 inches, and this is going to be 2.5 inches. So they will be a little bit smaller that they can take the market.
So another point to make about that though, Gulf Coast off-bottom mariculture is a much more productive, like oysters, like she was saying, come to market in less than a year. So you go look like at a Prince Edward Island oyster, that might be a 3 or 4 year old oyster because it spends a significant part of the year not really growing because it's cold-blooded,
Yeah.
exactly. So what's interesting about Texas and really the Gulf Coast is this is a great place to be doing this because, you know, we may go from R6 to market in 9 months, and so the productivity on an acreage basis can be.
It sounds like 7
6
months
months.
for,
Yeah, that's
and you know, and those other oysters are just growing there, it sounds like, and if you can't get anybody to pull them out, they'll get bigger and bigger. Tom, did you have a question?
Yeah, this is asking out of ignorance, but I remember reading about the wild oysters, that it wasn't uncommon, and I know our panelists can answer this, that depending on salinity, rain, stuff like that, that oysters could be harvested from one reef, moved to another reef, where it was believed they would be more productive. And to what extent is that done? And I remember thinking, oh, they found what was there, but.
I think this is an Emma question.
Yeah, so you're talking about transplants. We don't typically issue transplant permits anymore. Way back in the day, that's actually how the certificate of location or the lease program got started, is transplanting oysters out of waters that were closed from the Texas Department of State Health Services to leases to allow them to depurate, so they're not human health concerns anymore, and then sell them. But as Tracy mentioned, you have your own spat set, so that's not really a need to do that anymore. And also over time, the reason that was done was for two reasons. One, people were concerned that people would poach oysters out of those closed areas and it would be a human health concern and people would get sick. And two, they just thought that was another resource to move. But really, nobody's poaching them, no one's getting sick, really. And then the other thing is that we've really grown to realize the value of the oysters that are in those closed waters in terms of being protected sources of spat. Like they just keep pumping out spat in this area. So we actually don't really issue those transplants anymore, except under very special cases.
Let me, go ahead, sir.
Now, I have a quick question. I understand the oysters are not exactly the same, right? You got the wild oysters, but the mariculture oysters are specifically, kind of designed for mariculture. Is that correct?
Are you talking about the genetic material of them, or?
Yeah. I mean, there obviously, there's a lot of research going on to tailor the mariculture oysters, to grow faster, to be more resilient, which is all good, right? But they're not exactly the same oysters as the one you find in the wild.
Yeah, they can be genetically different, and so a lot of people will, you take it, without getting too science nerdy about this, you have to make them triploid, which makes them infertile, right?
No.
And so, well, with some cases of not quite 100% success. So
Just
basically
thinking
what
about
that does,
Jurassic Park and that
instead
one.
of taking the time to grow gonads and produce eggs, they take all of that time and energy and put it into meat. And so I think you kind of alluded to this, the mariculture industry makes a half shell, deep cup. It's a boutique oyster. It is a different or a complementary industry altogether. And that is kind of how you get that, is by using triploids, because they're not focused on reproduction.
Like, but they have to be local Gulf Coast oysters, it's not,
Yes,
right?
so,
So we're not bringing like an
yeah.
Eastern oyster, but not an East Coast oyster.
So yeah, a little history there. So before oyster mariculture, Texas did not allow oysters to come into Texas waters at all. We never issued introduction permits for oysters to come into public waters. So this was a big leap for us to go like, yes, now you can hatch things in hatcheries and put them in the water. That was a big jarring moment for us. And one of the reasons is because we have two genetic populations in Texas and nobody else has that. And so a lot of people say, why are you making this so difficult? Why aren't you doing this thing that other states are doing? Well, because we have the southern population acts differently in salinity. It spawns differently under different salinity regimes and things like that. So what we don't want is genetic escapement, somebody sending something to a hatchery. And then it coming back in the wrong place and then escaping. And a lot of that is because we have something to risk. We have a $30 million wild fishery where a lot of other states don't. So we don't let that happen. So we have super strict biosecurity protocols, as any of the farmers can tell you, but it is to protect that genetic integrity.
Let's, I feel we haven't talked about restoration enough. So, Haille, yes, one more question, but I want to get to Haille and John just to talk about restoration efforts in Texas waters. So question right here, sorry.
I do. So far, I've heard everybody speak about the salinity and the rains and the hurricanes. And TP did, speaking about human health concerns. I haven't heard anybody address the toxic spills that are affecting our waters, and our fisheries, our marine life, our habitats, our wetlands, the mangrove. Nobody's addressed that. And we have a problem. We have a very serious problem. I'm looking at this map here, and the Houston Ship Channel drops into the Houston Galveston Bay. And every year, we have flesh-eating bacteria. Every year, we're having people lose a limb, and now we're having people lose their lives. I'm here to petition for you folks. I'm here because I care about the petroleum industry. I think they're a great concern here. This is the mecca of the world, oil industry. But we need to be able to address these issues straight on, and we're not. And so you're telling me, I'm hearing you say that the oysters are already distressed or stressed. How do you think the chemicals are affecting the marine life? We're having porpoises come up on our beaches dead. We're having numerous fish die, and that's all the way around the coast, from California, from Texas all the way to Florida. I'm thinking, you know, don't you think a faucet that's continuing to sieve has got to have some effect on the water that we're drinking? Well, that's exactly what's happening here.
So is it fair to say it's the Department of State Health Services that really deals with the health issues related to oysters?
Human health issues.
Human
yeah.
health issues,
Yeah.
and does TBWD have any, I mean, clearly when we have spills, there are closures,
Yeah.
but is there any oversight on sort of long-term toxins in Galveston Bay related to oysters?
Any impacts to habitat, when it comes to the habitat aspect of it, whether habitat is lost or impacted, Parks and Wildlife has a process by which we seek restitution for damages to habitat, but if it is a human health concern, that's Texas Department of State Health Services.
Okay, and we don't have the limits to that, so we may have to go on to restoration. Haille, talk to us about Galveston Bay, oyster reef restoration, and oyster shell recycling, which you've already mentioned a little bit, but let's get into that a little bit. That's very positive.
Yeah, sure thing. So yeah, let's have some positivity here at the end. We are doing a lot to help return more oysters to the bay. We really make more habitat for the ones that are already here and spawning. So as I mentioned, we have our oyster shell recycling program. We now partner with over 25 restaurants stretching all the way from the inner loop of Houston down to Galveston Island. There's a sign on that back table there if you want to take a picture of it with your phone so you can look up where to go eat oysters and feel good about eating those oysters. We collect all that shell. We actually have a team of staff who collect those weekly. We go through a very serious quarantine process with those shells on land to ensure no bacteria, pathogens, non-native species are being produced. So all that shell that goes back into the bay is clean. And we do this through a variety of ways. We actually work with volunteers quite frequently to return those shell through building basically wave barriers along the shoreline. So not only does it create oyster habitat, it also protects some of our preserves. And we're also piloting some new projects where we actually place that shell, working with contractors coming off of a barge into a mountain formation to kind of give that new reef some height. So in instances like Hurricane Ike where we get sediment, some of the new oyster growth will survive that. Actually, hopefully this Thursday or Friday, we'll be returning about 350 tons of shell back into Dickinson Bay. So fingers crossed.
And then I was invited to speak at a Nature Conservancy board meeting this past week, and I saw a video with Haille in it about a restoration project that we worked on with the Nature Conservancy. You want to talk briefly about that project?
Yeah.
Specifically the concept of part of the reef is harvestable and part of it is not. It's more of a sanctuary reef.
Yeah, so this is a really exciting kind of new pilot project for Galveston Bay as well, working with the Nature Conservancy and actually Texas Parks and Wildlife Department came up with this idea of creating both harvestable and a sanctuary reef. They did lots of studies ahead of time to identify the typical trends in water flow, currents, tides, so that we know from that sanctuary reef in the center of two harvestable sites, if we position it just right, that larvae will actually spread to the harvestable reefs, hopefully sustaining that over time. So that just got finished back in 21. We're in the process of monitoring right now. Actually, Emma and some of her team come out with us. So we're starting to see some new spat out there, and this is up in Trinity Bay. So that is really great news because that's one of the areas we've had so much fresh water over the years. So it's great to see new oysters forming there.
So Haille, the divers just went out last week, and there's a ton of oysters.
Yeah.
Finally, in a hard year,
So the video I saw with Haille, I know about the project, but I just happened to see this video again recently. You know, the big rocks that you were putting in are the ones that are not harvestable, right? And how big were those rocks? Because it makes it hard for the oystermen to dredge those big rocks. I mean, what size are those? Do you remember what size those rocks were?
Oh gosh, I don't know the inches off the top of my head, but I mean some as big as this table. So the idea is that as a deterrent, because it would damage their dredge, there's really no way for us to go out there and police it daily, right? So it's just a way to deter that activity. Emma might be able to speak more to this than I can.
And I want to add something to that. Just when we do identify sites that are going to be, you know, some sanctuaries, sometimes they're called that. We're very careful to pick sites that are so degraded they're past the point of no return, and then the industry wouldn't be interested in harvesting there anyway. Just so you guys know, we're not taking public bottom away from an actively fished reef. If this thing was a muddy hole, and now it's a very large, very robust, high vertical relief reef.
Great. And on that note, I know TPWD has considered allowing actual restoration leases in the past. Maybe John or Emma can talk about that, and does that have a future, potentially a future in Texas?
Yeah, I mean, I think organizationally, that's something that organizationally we definitely want to see are these conservation reefs and these sanctuary type reefs that provide, a long time, they provide that natural seed source to the public reefs in the area ecosystem. I think that's a really important, one of the important steps as we move forward is to give that sanctuary to some of those things. I know in 17, there were 7 bays closed up and down the coast for this very purpose. Organizationally, we've worked a lot with Heart Research, Dr. Jennifer Pollack down in Corpus, and we actually are finishing that project right now there in St. Charles. It's close proximity to Copano Bay and Aransas Bay, and everything flows out, and it's going to Copano, it's going to Aransas, and those reefs have been very successful. The first phase of that reef was actually, I think, 10 days before Harvey, maybe 14, and much to our liking, after Harvey, that reef actually did very well, and there was SPAC, that next round of SPAC had to get set and continue to expand that reef. So it definitely has a place in the future, in the management of the future, and it's an important natural seeding process. They've been there for centuries, and this gives it a little bit more protection and an ability to keep this resource sustainable.
Yeah, my understanding is like North Carolina has 300 acres of restoration leases that are just not going to be harvested, and so again, it's another tool in the toolbox. Some say it's worth it, some might say it's not worth it, but I think TPW still has that on the table as a possibility.
Yeah, there are a lot of things on the table.
Yeah.
But I just kind of want to take back to the restoration discussion as a whole before I address that. So this summer, we actually just crossed the 600-acre threshold for Parks and Wild. We've now restored 601 acres of oyster habitat. We're very excited. 90% of that has been in Galveston Bay. And one of the things that you have to stress is that it really depends on where your funding is coming from. So some funding sources stipulate that it has to go to harvestable reefs, and that's a lot of what Parks and Wildlife does. A lot of the funding that we get is to stimulate the industry. And some funding sources stipulate that you cannot have it harvested at all. So that's something that really needs to be considered. And I think one thing about the Nature Conservancy project is it gave us an opportunity to work together a lot more closely and start having conversations about how we can leverage the sanctuary approach with the harvestable approach that we take. And so I guess what I'm saying, there is a time and a place where both are necessary. Again, Tracy mentioned it's really nice that we have the saturation, and we've never had to seed an oyster restoration. I hope you guys understand how cool that is, because every other state has to pay lots and lots of money to put oyster seed out on our restoration. As a restoration practitioner, my job is easy because all I have to do is put rock out, and I don't ever want it to change. But in recent years, as we see, SPAC numbers declining, that's when you start having to have conversations about, okay, maybe we need to consider reefs that are close to harvest in some very strategic locations, and usually paired with, this harvestable approach. And so that strategic approach where you have both types, working with multiple funding sources, working with multiple agencies, I think is the best approach to that. Restoration leases, they've been proposed, they're on the table of discussion, exactly how that would look in terms of how the code is currently written. Some laws may need to be changed to make it work exactly the way that you would want it to work. And so, there's other options for achieving that kind of non-harvestable status with different restoration sites, including, your site selection, putting them in closed waters, and other options as well. So we're kind of looking at all of that for some strategic approaches to restoration, getting all of the players in the same place and saying, what are your limitations, what can you do, and how can we restore together based on our own needs and funding.
Yeah.
What are you doing to remove the toxic substances from the water?
remove toxins.
So, you know, forgive me, but it's really not our focus tonight. I mean, there's a lot of
Well,
issues related to toxins and,
Right here, so it's part of the focus.
well, not this panel.
It is, or you're pontificating.
You're pontificating.
Hold on, I can handle it. So, let me talk to you afterwards. I'll tell you about our St. Lucie Waste Bit Superfund site that we're trying to get cleaned up, which is
I
where
understand.
a lot of the toxin is
These
coming from.
companies and people, I get stiff-armed, and they pontificate, and they talk about corporate governance and sustainability, and they're all wrong.
Okay, well, I appreciate it.
Because I deal in toxic spills. I know what I'm talking about.
I
I got a
believe
slew
it.
of engineers that can tell you about it.
Thank you for being here. Okay, where was I gonna go with that? Oh, one more question on leases. Like, so the leases seem to be working, right? So let's talk about the future of leases in Galveston Bay. You know, I know there's, on one hand, you know, making more public reefs private is maybe controversial, but those leases are sustainable farms.
Yeah, so I'm personally, this is my personal opinion, very glad that leases are on the table for discussion, expanding that program. There's some things that, again, like I said, I read code in my free time. So there's some things to understand about the law behind leases, and that one of them is that they actually can't go on existing oyster reefs. So it doesn't take a natural oyster reef and turn it into a private.
Okay.
They have to go on, and that's one of the things when you get to restoration sites. Well, it's not restoration, it's habitat conversion. There's a lot of nuance in the law around leases, and so it is on the table for discussion. There's a lot of discussion about how we would have to make that work in the current regulatory framework, or if the regulatory framework would have to be changed to accommodate it. So that's something, you know, we're always accepting input on, and it is something that we're discussing of what those challenges are moving forward and the pros and cons of that.
Yeah, and I know you can't speak for TPWD, but I've had some conversations, you know, where I've asked about this, and I know that Oystermen, maybe not all of them, but some of them were concerned we were gonna take leases away. That's not the direction I understand TPWD is going.
Existing leases?
Existing leases.
No, I
Right,
don't
so
believe
if
we're
anything,
going
we'd
that
be
direction,
expanding that
no.
process.
If anything,
Okay.
yeah.
Right, yeah, the organization, that's absolutely something we'd like to see expanded, is that lease program. It's, when you have that lease program, and Jeri, you know, Tracy and everybody, when they have those lease programs, it's an investment, so you're gonna take care of it, you're gonna baby it, and those guys have to have the ability, whether it's a 15-year lease, do we consider making a 20-year lease or longer, to take care of these ecological events as well. So, you know, that's their lease, they're gonna take care of it, they're gonna manage it to the most productive way possible.
Tracy, you're supportive of the lease program and potentially expanding it, or what are your thoughts?
Oh, definitely. I've been advocating for that for years. In fact, you had asked a question earlier about how come Texas was late to the game. Well, I was kind of the one that kept throwing it up at every meeting that, you know, Texas is the only one that didn't have an aquaculture program. I call it aquaculture, it's mariculture.
We did.
Didn't know the difference. And the reason I was saying that was because at the last time we renewed our leases, some folks in Parks and Wildlife, I don't think they're here anymore, were saying that the lease program was only predicated on deparation of oysters when transplanting from closed areas. 2014, I think, was the last year that we actually transplanted. Since then, we haven't had to, because everybody on the boat goes to jail for going into closed waters. When I say closed water, well, which now it's closed by Parks and Wildlife or the health department. But we got those penalties enhanced for everyone to go to jail so that it would protect the consumer and keep our good name. We don't want people getting sick off oysters in Texas or anywhere. The lease program, all of us with leases put lots of shell and rock back, tens of thousands of tons a year. I mean, we do personally. We also, in the program, I mean, oystermen, all oystermen, actually the dealer that buys the oysters, either has to put 30% of their shell back on public reefs or pay a fee in lieu of. And so there's a lot of money coming into the fund for restoration, and there's a lot of shell going out, or rock and shell going out for rebuilding the public reefs. And, you know, this year with it, we're going into a drought, we might have the best bat set ever, and then 2 years from now, we might have more oysters, and the price might drop to $10 a sack, who knows?
It's really a nice problem to have.
Yeah, I mean, just a few years ago, our boats were on less than the 30 sack limit a day. We would let them go out 2 or 3 days a week because there was an abundance of oysters. So it doesn't take long, you know. Mother Nature can kill a bunch of oysters real fast in a week, or in a couple of years you can have an abundance. All you gotta have is the shell there. And I would like to see a lease program to where it actually reduces the harvest pressure on the public reefs, and we can get those numbers down back to sustainable levels of harvest on public reefs. And I think more private leases would do that. We'd have to tie it directly to the boat license, I believe.
Yeah.
So, you know, where if you want a lease, then you're gonna give up some of your daily bag limit or your whole license for the public reef. I mean, I think that would be, otherwise, I don't see how you can really afford to buy those licenses back, because nobody's willing to sell their license for a one-time fee. You know, $30,000-$40,000, you're out of business.
Yeah, that would be the end of the career,
Yeah.
potentially.
And,
Well,
and one other thing, we're talking about sanctuary. In Texas, the health department closes a lot of areas, many square miles that are closed, that oystermen cannot harvest. And there's also a 300-foot perimeter around the shoreline of every bay. And from the Louisiana line to Coconut Bay, which I think is where the oyster oysters change right there. So the eastern oyster is in that area. There's actually 1/3 of the square miles that is unharvestable for oyster. So you have a built-in sanctuary area. And those areas are the ones that are really in need of reefs, because they're closed because the health department says the water quality is not good, so oysters will clean that up.
yeah, these are higher areas that are in higher bacteria levels.
Some are, and some are closed precautionary because maybe there's a channel
Too
coming
close
up.
to
Maybe
the
there's
shore.
a marina within a mile of it. They'll close an area, if there's a marina, 1 mile around it's closed. So if there's a city, we had a bathroom at the boat ramp, and they closed a big area which had one of our leases, or 2 of our leases in it. And once we found out what the reason was, we got the county to take the bathroom out. Every time the tide came up, it flooded. So now we got our leases back.
Shelley, question?
This is about restoration oysters and not the edible oysters, but a couple years ago, didn't the state of Texas pass a law that like 400 feet offshore, you know, you had to be at least that far away to harvest an oyster or something like that? And they have not gotten that message out to the public, because we see people coming up to the reefs we built with buckets and just like harvesting oysters, and we're like, that's against the law. And they go, we've been doing this our whole life. A few signs though would really help, because they really don't know they're doing anything wrong. Everybody doesn't read the newspaper and see what the legislature passed, and you
There's no
know,
signs of gaps in the
there's,
foundation.
Yeah.
well, I'm interested.
Well, I'm
in-
gonna
yeah.
say TPWD might put those on.
Yeah.
We can help, right?
And duly noted, I mean, and I think that's one thing that we're working on is getting word out a little bit better. You know, by law, we post it in the newspaper, and we do the public, yeah, and you're right, a lot of
Yeah.
people don't read that.
Just like
so-
people don't know what the purple on top of the post means,
Exactly.
you know? You
Yeah.
gotta make it easy for them.
No, that's a really good suggestion, and that we can, you know, work on our messaging a little bit.
Okay.
Well, I think we're getting close to the end. George,
I got a
one more question?
I got a question for Tracy, you being a, a oyster man, real oyster man. What is the impact of closing Rollover Pass on East Bay and all of East Bay oysters?
Well, I'll get the hang of this.
He hates you.
Now that we're done. There's no one answer for it, okay? When we were in a drought, you would think that closing that would help bring keep the high salinity out. Problem is, the water keeps coming in through tide changes, comes into Galveston Bay, and if you don't have fresh water coming in, the evaporation of fresh water, your salinity gets hypersaline. We were, I think, well above 40 parts per thousand during the drought, and the Gulf was 32. So having that water change there lets some of that hypersaline water get out into the Gulf. And then whenever you have floods, your Gulf water can come in and drop the salinity, or raise the salinity in the bay. Really, what I wish they would have done was put a gate on it and give me the remote control. Because for oysters, it's good for everybody.
Is it good or bad? It screwed up all the fishing in East Bay, so how's it done to the oysters?
It's going to take time to see. We've had so many other things that happen. I can't point to one thing is causing, last year, last year we lost about 50% of our oysters on our private leases. We had tax day flood, Memorial Day flood, Harvey, all that. Well, in Harvey, we lost 92% of our oysters to mortality from flooding. Now, you got to look at the right side. We might not have been able to harvest it and sell them, but I sure had a lot of dead shell that was on the bottom that I didn't have to take and haul out there. Now I've got a big shell pile because, I didn't have to put it out there. I was just going to cover up more shell that was going to catch a spat set. And so now what we're going to do this year is just sprinkle a little bit on all of them, and that was good fresh shell because the spat, they don't like it to be covered up in other fouling organisms like mussels and clams and barnacles and I think those other things might even eat some of the larvae floating in the water. I don't know because they all filter the water. I'm sure they do.
All right, well, so we're officially at our end, so I think what I need to do is thank all of our panelists. So, they have been great round of applause. Is there any closing words everybody has? Otherwise, I'll just say thank you. Don't feel compelled. Haille, there you go. Haille's reaching for the mic. All right.
Just want to remind everybody about the Houston Oyster and Sea Fest coming up, June 4th. Come see us, and every oyster in there, we will be recycling that shell.
And where is that event taking place, just so people know?
Is it Waterworks? Okay, yeah.
Waterworks, it's a Buffalo Bayou Partnership
Yes.
facility, so there's, just so happens there's a flyer on their table, you can probably figure it out.
Oh,
yes.
never reminded me.
Yes.
Even more exciting, at the Oyster Fest, one of our colleagues from Texas Parks and Wildlife Department will be playing with his band, and he has written a song about oysters.
Yeah, I'm gonna guess that's Bill Rodney's. Have you heard Bill Rodney's band before? Anyway, thank you all for being here today. Really appreciate it, and we'll look forward to seeing you through the year.
I